Okay, I'm going to start with a little straw poll. Hands up if you've read Capital. I mean finished it, not just had it sitting on your shelf for a little bit. Okay, not many. Okay, that's good. That's probably why you're all at this session. Maybe a few more hands for this question. Who here's tried to read Capital? Yeah? And you got to about chapter 3, I'm guessing, and then probably thought, this isn't for me. This is impossible to understand. Yeah? Yeah, quite a few nods of heads there. And you know what? I don't blame you if that's where you found yourself and why you're here today, because Capital is quite a dense tome, right? It is a difficult read. I'm not going to lie. I mean, the early chapters don't do Marx any favors, page after page about linen and coats and linen and back to the linen and the coats, and then there's a table that turns upside down. It's all very, it's all a bit surreal at points. But the point is, yeah, it is an excellent text. It deserves investment. I would say that, however, it's not the place to jump off and start your studies when it comes to Marxism. I think a lot of people, when they say, I'm a Marxist, I've got to read Capital first thing. Worst thing you can read first thing. Start with smaller text, start with things like wage, labor and capital, value, prices and profits, and of course, as Henry said, understanding Marx's Capital by not just myself, Rob Sewell as well, which you can get at the back. That's end of the plug. On to the talk. I think the important thing if you want to understand Marx's Capital, though, is you've got to understand Marx's method, right? It's the same with any of his economic writings. You can't understand it if you don't understand his method. That is dialectical materialism. In fact, I think it was Lenin who remarked that if you really want to begin understanding Capital, you've got to start by reading all of Hegel first, which I think would rule out all of us here, and myself included. I wouldn't go quite as far as this, but I would definitely say that, I would advise jumping in straight at the deep end. And it is true that it is impossible to understand Capital if you don't understand Marx's dialectical method, his scientific approach, dialectical materialism, which understands all phenomena, including the economy, as in their motion and their development, in their interconnectivity and in the many-sidedness. Marx and Marxism bases itself, as I say, on dialectical materialism. In particular, I just want to focus on this materialist aspect. What do we mean by that? We mean that we can understand the world and the economy in the sense of it being lawful, right? And any system, any phenomena has a lawfulness to it that can be understood, investigated, and in doing so, we can gain mastery over these laws. We can manipulate them to our advantage, and to a certain degree, we can overcome them. And this, the point with the laws of capitalism, however, is obviously they're invisible, right? We can't see them, you can't touch them. They operate behind our backs, and yet they very much impose themselves upon us like some sort of mystical force that governs our daily lives, right? And it's like gravity, right? You can't see it, and yet you can feel its effects every day. At the same time, these laws, they never appear in like a pure form. No laws in nature appear in a pure form, And Marx made the point, actually, that there's always a difference between the appearance, how things appear in reality, and their actual essence, the real dynamics that are governing that motion. Those two things are not coincidental, not directly coinciding. And that's because the real world's complex, right? It's not just made up of laws that you can touch. It's made up of ordinary people. It's chaotic. It's messy, if you like. There's therefore a need for scientific study to go and actually investigate these phenomena and uncover their objective laws without, I would add, losing sight that they have necessarily quite an abstract character when you're talking about the laws of capitalism, right? There's a need to always return back to the real world and analyze things concretely and in full of depth, color, and of course, contradiction as well. This isn't a mechanical system we're talking about. There's all sorts of accidental events, if you like, that bear upon the world on our perspectives. You can't reduce everything down to economics. There's, of course, politics as well. And we've got to take all of this into account when we're studying these phenomena around us, including the economy. And really, it's trying to understand these laws that govern the motion of the economy under capitalism. That's what Marx set out to do with Capital. He wanted to strip away any kind of mysticism surrounding the economy. You always hear very mystical kind of obscurantist words, right now. It's all about the bond markets. The bond markets. Who are the bond markets? You know, the invisible hand. You know, these kind of terms. The animal spirits. The herd mentality. These are the kind of words that bourgeois economics throws around, purposely designed to obscure and mystify the economy, make it seem like it's something we have no control over. And yeah, at the same time, Marx, said he wanted to understand things scientifically. The capitalist system is not just a list of kind of features, if you like. It's not something you can just superficially and impressionistically analyze. It's a system governed by objective laws and dynamics, as I say, that impose themselves upon us despite our wills, our desires, and our intentions, right? And you know, it's no matter what we'd like to do, there's these forces imposing themselves upon us. Capitalism, in other words, it has its own kind of logic, its own inherent logic. It's cold, callous, and intrinsic logic. And therefore, this is how we understand the world as opposed to the reformists, right? Reformists just see the economy, capitalism, it's just a list of features, and some features are bad, you know, inequality, austerity, you know, militarism, things like this. And they just say, well, let's just chop off the bad bits and keep the nice bits. We understand, no, there's this inherent logic that forces austerity, that forces militarism and so forth. And that's why Marx then drew these revolutionary conclusions. It's not just a lifestyle choice, it flows from the logic of this analysis. And I'd say also to understand Capital, it helps to understand the trajectory of Marx's thought, right? Marx and Marxism, you know, it started from the highest point of what came before, right? In terms of English Enlightenment, French Revolution, and so forth. As with all aspects of Marxism, philosophy, history, Marx economics didn't begin and end with Marx. You had, as I say, all these different aspects of what came before, the English materialists, Hegelian dialectics, French utopian socialism, and so forth. And what Marx and Engels did was forge all of these together into a consistent revolutionary outlook that they called scientific socialism. But in doing so, obviously, they had to also reject the worst elements of all of these trends and tendencies, all of these theories. There was confused, idealistic, retrograde trends and tendencies contained within all of these theories and thinkers. In the economic sphere, it was actually Engels who introduced Marx to the need to study what was called political economy. Engels had been based in England ahead of Marx, in Manchester, this industrial metropolis, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And it was in Britain that you had capitalism at its most advanced, where the laws of capitalism, if you like, were also most visible in a more pure form, if you like, where the class struggle was most developed, and where commodity production exchange was most developed. And that was there then that you had the beginnings of thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who tried to actually begin analyzing the economy in a scientific way. That was what political economy meant. These people were known as the classical economists, or today we just refer to them as the bourgeois economists, really. And they had a plus side, right? They tried to develop an understanding of capitalism as a scientific system and uncover the laws of this capitalist economy. And Marx, and in fact, along their way, they actually developed a lot of the ideas that Marx ended up basing himself upon and using as his starting point. And they had that positive side as well, the scientific method they were trying to employ. And Marx developed all of this. He built himself upon this. He enriched this. But they also had their negative sides that Marx had to criticize and reject. Most notably, the classical economists, they saw the economy, they saw capitalism as somehow being kind of ahistorical, if you like. It just always existed, basically. The laws of capitalism were basically like the laws of nature. They'd always existed. They're eternal, they're timeless, unchanging. And therefore, rather than studying the real development of capitalism, they based themselves purely on these kind of hypothetical thought experiments based on individuals laboring away, or pairs of individuals trading with each other. What Marx and Engels referred to as the Robinson Crusoe method. In other words, what you had in the economy was just an amalgamation of individuals. And if something was good for the individual, then you could scale it up. It'd be good. It'd be rational for society as a whole. And that's at the end of the day, because these figures like Adam Smith, they were liberals, right? They represented English liberalism. And for them, society was simply, or is simply, an amalgamation of individuals. And that was the basis for Adam Smith's faith in the invisible hand of the market, a belief that if everyone pursues their own individual interest, then it will create something that is good and rational, and for everyone, will all collectively be better off. And it was this kind of idealistic and individualistic aspect of Smith's ideas that his later followers, people after him and Ricardo and Marx, they based themselves on that side of economic thought, on actually the more reactionary side. Marx called these people the vulgar economists, in the sense that he said they were no longer interested in scientifically understanding capitalism, but had merely become apologists for capitalism. And I think you can very much see this today, whether it's these kind of free market fanatics like libertarians, or Keynesian policymakers, or the so-called academic Marxists and intellectuals. None of them really have an understanding of their own system, and none of them can make sense of the crisis and the instability that we see in the world economy today. Marx's method, in contrast to all of these, was, as I say, dialectical. And if you look at Capital, if you start reading it, this is where you need to have an appreciation of dialectics. You see how he kind of zooms out and alternates between these very high-level abstractions with symbols and equations, but then he zooms back into the workplace, and he looks at the real kind of brutal conditions of capitalism and inside the workplace, and says, what do these symbols and equations actually mean in reality, right? It doesn't reduce the economy down to a set of equations on a chalkboard, but understands, yeah, there's all this, as he puts it in Capital, all this blood and dirt dripping from every pore when it came to the origins and the continuation of capitalism. Now, yeah, in this dialectical method, Marx takes this complex, dynamic, chaotic system. He tries to dissect it scientifically, right? He looks at the individual parts, takes different aspects, different processes, but then he brings them back together, shows how they interact, how they interrelate, and how, yes, you can have these rational individual agents going around and pursuing their own interests, but when they interact, when they come together, it can create a dynamic that is completely irrational, if you like, for the system as a whole. You get these intrinsic crises. And in that respect, Marx understood that the laws of capitalism, yeah, they didn't exist kind of just in some ethereal plane. They were emergent. They came like an order out of chaos, if you like. They were a necessity expressing, or rather accident expressed the necessity behind these events, behind these phenomena. You have these emergent dynamics coming out of the interaction of all these individuals, each pursuing their own aims. But that's the point. Obviously, yeah, we can be pursuing our own aims, trying to put food on the table, but we come into conflict with others. We come into contact with others. We interact with the exchange. And in the process, yeah, you generate these tendencies, these trends, these laws. You know, an analogy might be like a cylinder of gas, for example. You know, you have all these particles bouncing around, interacting and colliding with one another. You can't predict what any one of those individually is going to move, what its motion is going to look like. But nevertheless, if you zoom out, you look at the cylinder as a whole, there are definite trends and tendencies that can be described and can be predicted. You get the laws of thermodynamics relating to temperature and pressure and so forth. And it's the same with capitalism. We're not interested in understanding this or that commodity or this or that individual, but understanding the motion, the dynamics of the system as a whole, which emerge out of all these interactions. But moreover, capitalism is not just a collection of individuals, right? Society is not made up of individuals. Isolated, but divided into classes. You have the vast bulk on the one side, the working class, who have nothing to sell but their labor power, their ability to work. And then on the other side, of course, they're forced to sell that labor power to the owners of the means of production, the capitalists. And it's this class perspective that also really separated Marx and Engels as well from their predecessors, understanding that, yeah, you can't reduce capitalism, as I say, to a set of equations or some graphs in a textbook. Anyone here study bourgeois economics? We heard about it yesterday. Anyone here? One of those unfortunate souls? One tentative, furtive hand goes up. Don't worry, we're not going to pick on you. But yeah, the point is, yeah, they do just reduce economics to a bunch of graphs, supply and demand and so forth. But capitalism is not this kind of mechanical machine in which we are some sort of inanimate cog. You know, it is ultimately composed of living flesh and blood. It is this living struggle between opposing classes. And Marx's aim was really to arm the working class and the nascent communist movement with the necessary theoretical arsenal. He said he wanted to deal the bourgeoisie a theoretical blow from which it will never recover. So Capital, if you've got to, again, to understand Capital, who's it aimed at? It's aimed actually as a polemic against his predecessors, against the classical economists. It's written in the language of political economy. And he said in this respect, it was designed to be the most terrible missile hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie. Really great language, Marx writes. And this is just a letter he wrote that in as well. Anyway, imagine writing an email like that today. But yes, it was this. And therefore, Marx really threw himself into grappling with the ideas of his predecessors. And he made enormous sacrifices, we should say, along the way. Capital was the product of years of grueling work and investigation, going into the British Library, which is now the British Museum, just down the road from here, every single day, looking at the journals, the reports, the theories of his peers and so forth, and pawning his goods to stay alive. You know, having to take up crappy journalism jobs, getting money from Engels, who supported him throughout all of this, and it shows what a mammoth task he had. Where did he begin? Well, but as I say, by taking up the best ideas of what had come before of the classical economists, but not stopping there, going further, grappling with them, showing their inherent contradictions and therefore the limits of those theories and ideas. And this meant starting with the building blocks of capitalism. He starts by examining the commodity, as he calls it. The beginning, I think the first page of Capital starts by saying, society's wealth under capitalism appears as an immense collection of commodities. What is a commodity? It's a good or service produced for exchange on the market, not for individual consumptions. Commodities have existed throughout class society, actually, but in earlier forms of society, the economy was not dominated by this kind of trade and exchange. Most productive activity would be for subsistence, or it would be directly appropriated by your feudal lord, your slave master, or so forth. Capitalism, by contrast, is where commodity production and exchange has become completely generalized. You think now today, all of life's necessities, we don't produce for ourselves anything really. It's all available on the market, and we use our wages to buy and these things, and everything is sold and available on the market. That's what a commodity is. These homogeneous goods that are available for sale on the market for exchange. Produced for exchange. And every commodity, Marx says, it has a dual property. On the one hand, it has to have some sort of usefulness, some sort of utility in society. If there wasn't that, there'd be no demand for it. You wouldn't be able to exchange it. It wouldn't be a commodity. Marx called that property the use value of the thing. And the use values are very varied between different commodities. But there's also some sort of, not a qualitative relationship like the use value, but a quantitative relationship between different commodities. How much can you exchange one commodity for another? What proportions are commodities exchanged? That quantitative relationship Marx called the exchange value. And how is that determined? Well, you have these right-wingers who talk about marginal utility theory, a completely kind of subjective idea of where value comes from. But this doesn't make any sense. All commodities have a different usefulness, right? You can't compare them on that basis. You can't compare them on the basis of the physical qualities. They obviously all look and feel very different, have different uses. But they have one thing in common, Marx says. All commodities have one property in common, which is that they are products of labor, right? And in that sense, the thing that you can compare between different commodities is the amount of labor time that's invested in the production. And it's labor, Marx pointed out, that is therefore the source of all new value in society. Now, this actually went back to the Adam Smith and Ricardo. They had a labor theory of value as well, explaining that, the value of a commodity depends on the relative amount of labor time contained within it. But for Smith and Ricardo, this was seen, as I say, from a very individualistic point of view, from the isolated individual, the Robinson Crusoe on his island, laboring away, maybe spending 4 hours in the morning building a boat, and then 4 hours in the afternoon harvesting 100 coconuts, and then saying, my boat is worth the same as 100 coconuts, or vice versa. Marx went further than this. He said, what you need to understand is not the individual labor time invested in a product, but it's socially necessary labor time. And that was a key development of Marx's, along with also explaining the difference between value and price, which I'll come on to as well. We don't exchange commodities directly as individuals, but through the market, right? We buy and sell in shops, online, and so forth. And when we do, we're confronted not with haggling, but with an objective market price, right? And that price, in general, will reflect the socially necessary labor time of the commodities of the socially necessary labor time that's gone into the commodity. The average labor time needed to produce a given commodity based on the current social and historical conditions, i.e. based on the current level of technology and technique and so forth within society. At the end of the day, right, the market, if you go onto Amazon as a seller, no one's going to care on the other end whether you're more efficient or less efficient. They just want to be able to buy the best and cheapest goods. And if a business is too inefficient, obviously, if its costs are above the market price, then it's going to go under, right? It's going to be put out of business. On the other side, if you're super efficient, if you can lower your costs below the average price on the market, you can capture more of a market share, and you can make super profits, right? The most efficient enterprises in this sense will push out the least efficient and will gain access to more of the market, more of the profits. Now, Marx's labor theory of value that he's outlining in Capital, therefore the whole of Capital, assumes basically a perfect free market for the sake of trying to understand these laws of value. It takes away all the kind of the complexities of like monopolies and so forth. There's another talk this afternoon. I'm giving that one as well. Come to that if you want to understand about monopolies. But the point is, where you have things like monopolies, it restricts the supply, and you can't have an equilibrium, if you like, and prices can vastly exceed values, and the law of value kind of breaks down. This is the case with obviously rare items, with things where there's a restriction on supply, things like housing costs, for example. Most housing in most cities, there is a restricted supply of it, and therefore the price is far more determined by supply and demand, almost entirely by supply and demand, than it is by the actual value, the actual social necessary labor time that's gone into producing that house. And it's the same with things like rare items and other vehicles for speculation. Nicholas here is giving a talk on that tomorrow. We can say more then. But the point is that these kind of examples, these exceptions, they don't negate the labor theory of value. If anything, they kind of show actually the exception proves the rule, if you like, right? Take a rare item like a Picasso painting, for example, right? There's a limited supply. He's dead. He's never going to produce anymore. And therefore, the ones that are there, you can't increase their supply, and the price of them is going to be almost solely dictated by the demand for it. And obviously, if you then came along and tried to sell fake Picassos, right, or you just own a printing shop that produces artwork, what are you going to charge for that? You're going to charge, on average, competing against everyone else, the cost of the labor, the materials, and the printing costs, and so forth. In other words, the price is going to tend towards the value once you've got an actual commodity, something that's homogeneous and replicable, and so forth. So you can see that, where the labor theory of value really applies is in not these exceptions, which is what marginal utility and so forth always focus on, but the general case, which under capitalism, which is these massive commodities being produced with the competition and so forth. And in an ideal free market, therefore, you have value being the axis around which price will fluctuate according to supply and demand. Price signals act under capitalism as a way of kind of guiding investment and capital around the economy. If you have demand far in excess of supply in a certain industry, then that's going to mean you can push prices above their value. The people in those industries will make super profits, and that will entice other investors to come in and increase the supply. Actually, try and take advantage of those super profits, and you'll get kind of equilibrium, if you like, being restored. And vice versa on the other side, if supply exceeds demand, and you'll get mothballing of factories and so forth. But behind all of this volatility and this flux of prices, there's clearly something objective, right? There is, as I say, from this chaos, a certain order emerging. Commodities prices can seem very random, if you like, almost accidental, but there is this objective lawfulness that governs the exchange, right? Take an obvious example, like cars and pens, for example, right? There's a lot of cars in the world, big supply. I don't know the exact number. There's a lot of pens in the world, and I'm sure there's large demands for both of them. Maybe not so much for pens these days, maybe not for cars in the future. I don't know. The point is, there's a large amount of both when it comes to supply and demand. That doesn't determine why, in general, even the most bust-up car will be worth a lot more than even the most expensive pen. There's clearly something objective that leads to the cars being on average more expensive than the pens, and that is the socially necessary labor time that they embody, which includes, Marx says, on the one hand, the dead labor, as he called it, the labor that's gone into all the raw materials, into the factories, into the machinery that produces these goods, which is obviously a lot of it's highly automated these days. There's a lot of dead labor, though, in that automation, in that machinery, in that technology. On the other hand, there's the living labor, he says, the new labor that's added in the course of production by the working class. Now, that, in summary, is the law of value, the law that governs the capitalist market and the capitalist market economy. But it governs it, we should add, in a completely anarchic and unplanned way. Nevertheless, there is that lawfulness to the economy that governs the motion of commodities, that establishes the proportion in which commodities are exchanged with each other, and hence their prices on average on the market. It's what regulates, if you like, the allocation of society's resources, the international division of labor, if you like, with labor and industry within different industries, according to, we should add, according to the needs, so the profits of the capitalists rather than the needs of society. And it's also what determines the value of money, which is a very key question for understanding inflation. I don't have time to really go into that. Maybe someone can add more in the discussion. But the point is, obviously, that, yeah, the amount of money in circulation has to represent the amount of value in circulation in the form of commodities. If you double the amount of money in circulation without doubling the amount of value with commodities, embedded in commodities, then you're going to see, in general, all else being equal, a doubling of prices. And anyway, maybe someone else can expand on that later. But we should add on that point, what is money, right? If you want to really understand inflation, you have got to understand what is money. Money, Marx says, this is where you probably, if any of you have tried reading Capital, got stuck, chapter 3 on money. Money, Marx says, there is a representation of value. It's a measure of value. It's a yardstick, effectively, against which all other commodities' values can be compared, right? It emerges historically as what Marx called the universal equivalent, right? A commodity like precious metals, like gold, against which all others can be compared. It allows for exchange, therefore, the exchange of any commodity for that universal commodity, which facilitates trade. Over time, however, the precious metals, the gold, the silver, they get pushed out, they get replaced by mere tokens of value, representations of value, like paper notes, or today, just numbers on a screen. It's largely digital these days. And this plays a very progressive role in the development of capitalism, development of the productive forces more generally before capitalism, going back to the earliest forms of class society. It acts to break up exchange into two parts, right? Into a sale of commodities into money, and then a purchase of money back into commodities, right? This is what we do when we earn a wage, right? We sell our labor power, our commodity, we gain wages, this money, and we use it to then go back into the shops to buy all the other things that we need. The point is, however, that as well as having that progressive side, it introduces potential for contradiction, right? Because now you've separated out the amount of money that's in circulation from the amount of commodities in circulation. You've got the potential to have debasement of currencies, you know, flooding the economy flooding circulation with more notes and so forth, or devalued coins. And you have the potential for credit, you know, expanding the money supply and actually creating bubbles where the amount of money far exceeds the amount of value, and you get fictitious capital, which again, I think Nicholas will be covering in his talk tomorrow. And this is the point. Capitalism is not simply based on money, it's based on capital, right? That's why we have the name Capital, the book. And what is capital? Marx explains it is value that is trying to create more value. Self-valorizing value is the term he uses. In other words, money that's used to create more money. The starting and end point for capitalism is not our needs, it's not the commodities, it is the money, right? The capitalist starts with money, tries to use that to make more money. And in that sense, yeah, the whole system is governed not by needs, it's production for profit. We've got to never lose sight of that when we're understanding capitalism and its contradictions. It is not based on what's rational, what's necessary. It's based on what makes the most profit for the individual capitalists. Now, how do they do that? How do the capitalists generate their profits? Well, it can't be simply through kind of cheating and swindling. There's for sure a lot of that going on under capitalism, speculation, buying cheap to sell dear and so on. But none of that creates new value, right? All of that is just forms of exchange that can redistribute value that's already been created, right? If you rob Peter to pay Paul, society as a whole does not get any richer. Peter and Paul have the same amount that they started with, right? So where does profit come from? That was the enigma that really eluded the classical economists before Marx. They couldn't really explain where this profit, this surplus value came from in society. And Marx was the one who solved this by explaining that profit comes from within production, not exchange, right? And the key lies in a very special commodity that the working class possesses, which I've already mentioned. It's labor power, right? Its capacity or its ability to work. And that can be, for even an hour these days on Uber and things like that, or a day, a week, a month, a year, whatever your contract is. You have the capacity to work, you sell that to the capitalist, and they buy that. They don't buy the actual output of your work, they don't buy the actual labor, but they buy your ability to work for that time, and they get to do what they want with that time. It's like the difference between paying for a computer that can generate data and buying the actual data, right? The data would be the output, the computer would be the labor power, if you like, in this analogy. Same with a light and a light bulb. You buy a light bulb, you don't pay for a certain amount of luminescence in a room, right? And this difference between labor and labor power is key for understanding where profit comes from. The labor, if you like, is like the use value that the capitalist gets out of the labor power, right? They get the actual output of the worker's work, but they pay for, with wages, the labor power. The wages then are the exchange value of that labor power. And the source of profits is basically the difference between the two. The value produced by the worker in the course of an hour or day is going to be more than what they're paid back in the form of wages, right? The use value of the labor power is greater than its exchange value. And this is possible because labor power itself is a commodity, as I say, and it has a value determined in the same way as any other commodity by its socially necessary labor time, which in the case of labor power means the labor time needed to maintain and reproduce not just the individual worker, but the working class as a whole, right? Their clothing, their food, their shelter, and of course, being able to raise a family. If you can't do that, the working class is going to die out. You get labor shortages. That's actually a lot of what is happening in the world economy today, actually. They've pushed wages very far down. There are labor shortages in key industries. And yes, the solution to the mystery of profit then lies in this, the fact that the socially necessary labor time needed to maintain the working class is less than the value that the working class produce, right? The worker or the working class on average might work for 8, 9, 10 hours a day, but it might only take 4 hours to actually produce all the commodities that go into maintaining the working class, all that clothing, the food, the healthcare, the education, and so forth. And the rest of it, from the point of view of the capitalist, is effectively free, right? It is this surplus value. The working class is only receiving back a fraction in the form of wages, the value that they produce. And the unpaid labor then of the working class, the unpaid labor is the source of this surplus value, which gets divided up between the different sections of capitalists. So the capitalists take the profit, the bankers get the interest, and the landlords get the rent. And this average wage, this is that we're talking about here, again, like with any thing, we're talking about the average. The average wage then is set by this socially necessary labor time, but it has a historical and social component to it, right? It's not just something automatically determined, right? The working class is unlike other commodities, can organize to push up the price of its labor power, right? That's the whole point of trade unionism. And so the physical needs obviously set the very minimum, right? If you can't maintain the working class, it will die out, as I say, and you get these labor shortages. The maximum is set by basically the profitability of the capitalists, right? If they can't produce at a profit, because given the wage levels, they will not produce. That's the important point here, that there's a limit to how much the wages will be under capitalism. And everything in between that really is determined by class struggle. Obviously, the class struggle of the capitalists on one side, as I say, are compelled by the force of competition, this objective force, to try and lower the wages, lower the conditions of the workers, maximize their profits. On the other side, you've got the working class, which is compelled to of course, sell their labor power in exchange for a wage, right? You can choose which employer you have to a certain degree, but you can't choose whether to be employed. You're compelled to sell your labor power to obtain these basic necessities, but we're compelled to organize, right? And to mobilize. And Marx made the point that without organization, the working class is just raw material for exploitation. Now, if you understand, the law of value and the secret of profit, really all of the other dynamics of capitalism that Marx explains flow from this, right? It explains on the one side how capitalism was able to play this very progressive role in its heyday, because unlike previous modes of production, the capitalist is buying this labor power of the worker. In the enslaved society, you buy the actual slave themselves as the commodity. Here, you buy the time. And then the capitalist has an incentive to use that time as effectively as they can to increase the productivity of labor, to invest in technology, in education, and so forth, and to make them as productive as possible. They also have an incentive to reduce labor costs so they can produce below the current value, i.e. below the socially necessary labor time, drive out their competitors. And all of that incentive, is what compels the capitalist to invest in machinery and technology, in automation, and technology and technique to improve the productivity of labor, to get as much use value out of the labor power in the given unit of time that they bought. And that's what leads to, in the early days of capitalism, this rapid development of the productive forces, as we call it, science, technology, industry, and so forth. But the point is that these initially progressive forces turn into their opposite, and they sow the seeds of their own destruction. Capitalism creates these inherent crises. The laws of capitalism inherently lead to crisis. Production for profit, private ownership, along with the barrier of the nation state, become a titanic barrier to social progress. And you see all these contradictions emerge that hold capitalism and society under capitalism back. Firstly, I want to describe is the idea of the rate of profit and the tendency for that to fall. You have this investment in machinery and technology leading over time for a tendency to the capitalist to receive less profit for a given amount of investment. And that's because it's only living labor that produces new value. The value of a commodity, Marx says, can be divided up to the dead labor that I talked about earlier, which Marx also refers to as the constant capital, the raw materials, the equipment, the factories, the infrastructure, and then also the living labor, which he also refers to as variable capital, and then also the surplus value that produces, the workers' unpaid labor. These form the kind of three parts in which the commodities value is divided up. But the point is that constant bit doesn't add any new value. That's why it's called constant capital, right? Machines, factories, software as well today. All of that does is transfer its value over the course of the lifetime of the machine or so forth into the commodities in the course of production. It's only the variable capital, the labor power that's purchased, that produces new surplus value. So you think about it, right? AI, automation, machinery, all of these sorts of things, robots, they might seem impressive, sometimes very little in terms of their impressiveness, but they are, at the end of the day, just tools for trying to increase workers' productivity. I mean, putting aside Sora and the hilarious videos that it makes and things like that. The reason that the capitalists might invest in any of this stuff is to obviously boost workers' productivity. But more investment in that kind of technology means proportionally having more constant capital compared to the variable part, more machinery and automation behind each worker. And that really just means killing the goose that lays the golden egg under capitalism, because it's that variable part, it's the worker that's creating all the new value, including the surplus value, the profit. And therefore the result is that as the capitalists invest, all other things being equal, and that is an important caveat, all other things being equal, they will see a falling rate of profit as they invest in technology. You see the same dynamics of capitalism also leading to the capitalist accumulation and free competition turning into its opposite. You get this chasm of inequality opening up. The more efficient businesses driving out the least efficient, gobbling up the weaker ones, generating monopolies. Again, talk more about this afternoon. And you get this concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, an inherent part of capitalism. Again, inequality is not some kind of nasty symptom that we can just get rid of, keep capitalism. It's inherent within capitalism, unlike what the reformists say. Marx says it's accumulation of wealth at one end and misery and toil and degradation at the other. And the nature of capitalism also leads it to fall into deep crisis. He says it becomes like the sorcerer who's conjured up powers from beyond the netherworld that it can no longer control. You have the forces of production outstripping the limits of the markets, the ability to produce outstripping the ability of the market to absorb what is being produced, right? Workers cannot buy back all the commodities necessarily. This is the case because of where profit comes from. Workers cannot afford to buy back all the goods that they produce. And therefore you get these periodic crises of overproduction, as Marx called it, which are again inherent part of the system. And what we're living through today, 17 years on since the 2008 crisis, is the result of that, right? Since the 2008 slump, which was an organic crisis of capitalism, as we call it, a crisis of overproduction from which there's never really been any recovery. It's been compounded by pandemic, by war, and obviously the working class has been asked to pick up the bill at every stage, and there's no end in sight under capitalism, only intensifying contradictions, as Alan pointed out yesterday. The ruling class has repeatedly bailed out the system with this state intervention, stimulus support. We should add on that, so much for the efficiency of the free market, right? So, as Alan said, where's the free market when you're handing over billions and trillions to big business and the banks? The point is now, having done that, there's no ammo left in their arsenal, and they're sitting atop this ticking time bomb of debt, all while preparing for the next big slump, which could come any day now from a number of places, the AI bubble and so forth. And of course, all these other contradictions this is adding to, the protectionism, the conflict, the speculation. And it's very clear in this respect that the capitalists have no solutions. Keynesianism and state spending hasn't worked. Austerity and attacks haven't worked. But we have to add, there's no such thing as a final crisis of capitalism in this respect. The working class will constantly be made to pay by the ruling class as long as capitalism exists through further attacks on austerity. And that will provoke more anger, more revolutionary explosions. But I just want to finish then, in the few minutes I've got left, just to say then, brought it back to the beginning, right? Marx's Capital, like, it's not an academic text, it's to arm us, it's arm the communist movement. How do we apply Marxist economics to the chaotic world around us today? Well, it is by going back and trying to understand that scientific method of Marxism, understanding the general laws and dynamics of the capitalist system, but learning to apply these to the particular phenomena as they appear around us, whether it's these global crises, the inflation, the disputes as well in particular industries and workplaces that ultimately are driven by these laws of capitalism. Looking at all these cases concretely, examining the facts, looking at the process in its totality and trying to discern the main contradictions and pressures at play. When we study history, we can study a whole host of particular revolutions to draw out the dynamics, if you like, the essence of revolution, the general laws of revolution. But we apply those generalizations back to understand how consciousness changes, right? We understand there's no such thing today as like a pure revolution, if you like. When we're discussing perspectives, we don't live off abstractions. We go and study the real process that's unfolding, the concrete case in front of us, and we try and seek to draw out the political conclusions. In other words, we use our theory as a guide to action. And it's got to be the same when we're talking about economics, right? We're studying economic history, for example, including all these different crises of capitalism throughout its hundreds of years to understand the essential dynamics of capitalism. But we have to understand economic phenomena concretely also, not understanding capitalism as some mechanical machine, but as this struggle of living forces impacted by politics and these non-economic events. And not lose sight of why we analyze economics, why we're having these discussions. It's not for scoring points against the bourgeois, theoretically. It's not for just a nice academic discussion. It's to make sense of these contradictory processes that are going on as a guide to action and understanding the impact that these crises, these events are having on consciousness and getting across the fundamental point that the conclusion of all of this has to be that capitalism cannot be patched up. It has to be overthrown and replaced by a new system with its own economic laws, those of socialism and communism. I'll leave it there.